My parents called me an unplanned child. When they kicked me out of the house, my grandparents helped me by buying me a home. When my parents broke into my place, they claimed it was their house. Hey, everyone. I guess I just need to get this off my chest. I'm Jake, and looking back, my childhood wasn't typical, to say the least. My parents, Sarah and Mark, weren't bad people. They were just entirely unprepared for the whole idea of raising a kid. They were both ambitious, career-driven, and deeply invested in their business, a small but growing marketing agency. From what I've pieced together over the years, I wasn't exactly part of their life plan. I was, as my dad once said during an argument when I was a teenager, an accident. Yep, ouch. Mom and Dad got married young. They'd started the business together while still in college, and it quickly became their everything. By the time I came along, they were knee-deep in meetings, client calls, and late-night brainstorming sessions. My mom liked to joke, half seriously, that their agency was their first baby. Guess I was the unexpected second. From the get-go, I was more or less left to my own devices. When I was really young, my parents hired a nanny, but she was more like a stranger who made sure I didn't die while my parents were away. I don't remember her name, but I do remember how detached she seemed, always glued to her phone while I watched cartoons or banged away on some toy piano. When I turned 5, she was gone. My parents figured I'd be in school soon enough, so there wasn't a need for childcare anymore. School was, well, it wasn't much better. I wasn't neglected in the horror story sense. I always had food, clothes, and a roof over my head. But emotionally, it felt like I didn't really exist to my parents. I'd come home from kindergarten with crayon drawings and stories to share, but they'd barely glance up from their laptops. They'd murmur something like, "That's nice, Jake," before diving back into whatever project had them hooked that day. After a while, I stopped trying. Teachers quickly became my stand-in parents. Mrs. Rosen, my first grade teacher, was the first adult who seemed genuinely interested in me. She'd ask about my favorite books, my hobbies, or how my weekend had been. It was like she actually cared, which felt foreign but nice. I clung to that. I think she noticed, too, because she started giving me extra attention, even letting me hang back in the classroom after school to help clean up while we talked. Looking back, she probably knew something wasn't right at home. But the real savior of my childhood? Video games. My parents had bought me a PlayStation when I was 6, thinking it would keep me busy and out of their hair. It worked. I'd spend hours immersed in those pixelated worlds where the rules were clear and I had control. It was addicting, especially compared to the chaotic, indifferent reality of my home life. By the time I was 8, I had a routine down. I'd wake up, get ready for school, walk there by myself, and come home to an empty house. My parents were always at the office, sometimes until midnight. I'd heat up a microwave dinner, settle in front of the TV, and lose myself in whatever game I was obsessed with at the time. Sometimes I'd look out the window at the neighborhood kids playing outside and wonder if I was missing something. But it didn't matter. Even if I joined them, I wouldn't know what to do. It wasn't all bad, though. I got good at being alone. I learned how to cook basic meals, thank you, YouTube, do laundry, and keep myself entertained. By the time I hit middle school, I was pretty self-sufficient. My parents saw this as proof that their hands-off parenting style was working. "Look at Jake," they'd say to friends during dinner parties. "He's so independent." I hated that. It felt like they were taking credit for a skill I developed out of necessity, not because of anything they'd done. Middle school was when things started to shift, though. I met Oliver, my first real friend. He was the new kid, kind of quiet and nerdy, just like me. We bonded over a shared love of fantasy RPGs and spent countless afternoons at his house playing on his PC. His parents were the opposite of mine, warm, attentive, and involved. They'd always invite me to stay for dinner, ask about my day, and make me feel welcome. It was weird. Good, but weird. I didn't know parents could be like that. Of course, spending time with Oliver's family only highlighted what was missing in my own. One night, after dinner at his place, I came home to find a note on the fridge. Working late. Leftovers in the fridge. Love, Mom. Love? Sure, Mom. I crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. High school came next, and with it, a whole new set of challenges. My parents' business had taken off by then, which meant even less time for me. They started traveling for work, conferences, client meetings in other states, you name it. Sometimes they'd be gone for weeks at a time, leaving me with some cash and a "be good, Jake," as they headed out the door. I didn't mind at first. I was used to being on my own by then. But as the weeks turned into months and the months turned into years, it started to eat at me. I'd see other kids at school with their parents at football games, parent-teacher conferences, and award ceremonies. My parents never showed up. Not once. I started lying about it to avoid the pitying looks. "Oh, they're out of town on business," I'd say, shrugging like it didn't bother me. But it did. As soon as I turned 21, my parents decided they were done with me. The announcement came during breakfast one morning. My mom barely glanced up from her tablet as she said, "Jake, you're 21 now. It's time for you to start your own life." My dad chimed in, saying they'd set aside some savings to get me started, but that I was officially on my own. There wasn't any drama or heartfelt goodbye, just a matter-of-fact declaration that it was time for me to go. I found a small, dingy apartment on the edge of town. The place was miserable, tiny, with peeling wallpaper, a kitchen the size of a closet, and a smell I could never quite identify but could never get rid of either. The money my parents had given me didn't last long, and I soon found myself working part-time at a diner to make ends meet. The pay was terrible, but it kept a roof over my head, barely. Most days, I dragged myself home after a long shift, too tired to do much more than microwave a cheap TV dinner and crash on the couch. The loneliness hit me hard. My parents were practically ghosts in my life, too busy with their business to check in, and I didn't have anyone else to rely on. I'd call them occasionally, but the conversations were short and filled with generic advice that made it clear they weren't really listening. Eventually, I stopped trying. Things changed when I met Matt. He was a regular at the diner and struck up a conversation with me one slow afternoon. Before long, we were talking about everything from video games to the ridiculous cost of living in the city. When he found out I was struggling with rent, he suggested we split a place together. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Living with Matt was chaotic. He was fun, sure, but completely unreliable. He'd throw parties without warning, leave dishes piled up for days, and conveniently forget when bills were due. One night, I came home to find strangers passed out all over the apartment, including one guy snoring in the bathtub. Still, splitting rent made things easier, and for a while, I didn't mind the chaos. Matt introduced me to his friends, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had a social life. It didn't last. Matt lost his job after a few months, and without his share of the rent, I couldn't afford the apartment. I worked double shifts at the diner, but it wasn't enough. Eventually, Matt moved back in with his parents, and I was forced to leave. With nowhere else to go, I ended up renting an old trailer from a retired mechanic named Earl. The trailer was barely livable. The walls were paper-thin, the plumbing was unreliable, and the roof leaked whenever it rained. Earl was a gruff but decent guy who'd occasionally bring over leftovers from his barbecues or check in to make sure I was doing okay. Despite his kindness, the isolation was crushing. I spent most of my time working, eating, and sleeping, with nothing to break up the monotony. One night, as I was walking home from work, I heard shouting in a dark alley. Two men were arguing, their voices echoing off the walls. I tried to slip by unnoticed, but one of them saw me and barked, "Hey, you!" My heart raced as I stammered that I was just passing through. He glared at me for what felt like an eternity before letting me go. The next day, I heard that someone had been mugged in that alley. I didn't know if it was the same guys, but the thought haunted me. Not long after, there was a break-in at the trailer park. Someone smashed the windows of the trailer next to mine and stole a TV and some cash. Earl was furious, but the cops didn't seem to care. It was just another reminder of how unsafe the area was. But I didn't have the money to move somewhere better. Life in the trailer was bleak. Most nights, I'd sit on the tiny porch, staring up at the stars and wondering how everything had gone so wrong. I felt like I was barely keeping my head above water, constantly struggling to make ends meet. The few friends I'd made through Matt had drifted away, and my parents were as distant as ever. Survival was the only thing on my mind, and even that felt like an uphill battle. Living in the trailer felt like rock bottom. I'd been scraping by for what felt like forever, stuck in a cycle of work, bills, and loneliness. But then, out of nowhere, Elizabeth came into my life. She was my neighbor, an older woman in her late 60s, with sharp eyes and a kind smile. Elizabeth wasn't someone I paid much attention to at first. She lived a few trailers down and spent most of her time tending to the tiny garden she'd managed to grow in the dusty soil of the trailer park. One evening, I was sitting on my porch, nursing a cheap beer and trying not to think too much about my problems, when she came over. "You look like you could use some company," she said, holding out a plate of cookies. I couldn't say no to cookies, so I shrugged and gestured for her to sit. Elizabeth was one of those people who could talk to anyone. Within minutes, she'd gotten me to open up about my life, something I hadn't done in years. I told her about my parents, how they'd all but abandoned me, and how I'd ended up in the trailer. She listened intently, nodding here and there, but never interrupting. When I was done, she said something that stuck with me. "You're too young to be this lost. Have you ever tried reconnecting with your family?" I laughed bitterly and told her I didn't have any family left. But she pressed me. "Everyone has someone, even if it's a distant cousin or a forgotten aunt. Let me help you look." I didn't think much of it at the time, but a few days later, she knocked on my door with a notebook in hand. "I've been digging around," she said, flipping through pages filled with scribbled notes. "Do you know your dad's parents? Ben and Marge?" The names hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't thought about my grandparents in years. My parents had been estranged from them for as long as I could remember, and I'd only met them a handful of times when I was very young. I told Elizabeth as much, but she didn't seem fazed. "Well, they're alive and living in Vermont," she said, handing me a piece of paper with their phone number on it. "They deserve to know about you." It took me a week to work up the courage to call. When I finally dialed the number, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. A man answered, his voice gravelly and unfamiliar. "Hello? Hi, this is Jake," I stammered. "Jake Carter. I think I'm your grandson." There was a long pause, and I braced myself for the worst. But then the man, Ben, spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "Jake? Is it really you?" I ended up talking to him and Marge for hours. They were overjoyed to hear from me and immediately invited me to visit. I couldn't believe it. After years of feeling like I had no one, here were these two people who genuinely wanted me in their lives. When I arrived at their house a few weeks later, I was blown away. They lived in a cozy, two-story home surrounded by rolling hills and vibrant green trees. Marge greeted me with a hug that nearly knocked the wind out of me, and Ben clapped me on the back like he'd known me forever. They were warm, kind, and everything I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Over the next few days, we talked about everything. My childhood, their estrangement from my parents, and how much they regretted losing touch. It turned out that the rift had been over something petty, a business disagreement that had spiraled out of control. They'd wanted to reach out to me over the years, but hadn't known how. Their support changed everything for me. When I told them about my struggles, they insisted on helping. They offered to pay for me to finish college, something I'd given up on long ago. I tried to argue, but Marge wouldn't hear it. "Your family," she said firmly. "Let us do this for you." Thanks to them, I was able to enroll in a local university and finally earn my degree. The difference it made in my life was staggering. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a future. I worked hard, determined to make them proud, and they were there for me every step of the way, cheering me on, offering advice, and even attending my graduation. After I finished school, Ben and Marge surprised me with another gift. They'd found a house for sale in their town, a charming little place with a picket fence and a big backyard. It needed some work, but they were willing to help me buy it. The owner, a family friend, was selling it for $150,000, only a third of its real value. I couldn't believe my luck. Moving into that house was surreal. It wasn't just a roof over my head. It was a symbol of how far I'd come. With Ben and Marge's help, I fixed it up bit by bit, turning it into a home I could be proud of. It wasn't perfect. There were still plenty of challenges ahead, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Elizabeth came to visit me shortly after I moved in. She stood on the porch, looking around with a satisfied smile. "Told you you weren't alone," she said. I couldn't thank her enough. If it hadn't been for her, I never would have found my grandparents or built the life I had now. She just waved me off. You would have figured it out eventually. I just gave you a nudge. 15 years had passed since my parents told me to fend for myself. Life had moved on, and I'd built something stable, even good. My grandparents, Ben and Marge, had been a blessing, helping me turn my life around. I'd settled into my house, a place I'd painstakingly renovated over the years, and had a steady job that paid the bills. I hadn't heard much from my parents during those years, just the occasional impersonal holiday card or email. They drifted into the background of my life, and I assumed they were content with theirs. It was a crisp autumn evening when everything started to unravel. I'd just returned from work and was getting dinner started when I noticed something odd. A light flickered on in the upstairs guest bedroom, the one I rarely used. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I hadn't turned it on. Grabbing a heavy flashlight, I crept upstairs, every creak of the wooden floorboards sending a chill down my spine. When I pushed open the door, I froze. My parents, yes, Sarah and Mark, were standing there, casually unpacking bags like they belonged there. My dad glanced up, unfazed, and said, "Oh, hey, Jake. Long time no see." I was too stunned to speak. Finally, I managed to sputter. "What the hell are you doing here?" Mom smiled like this was some kind of reunion. "We've decided to move in. This is family property, after all." Excuse me? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was my house. I'd bought it with my grandparents' help and poured years of work into making it a home. They had no claim to it. They didn't seem to care about my outrage. My dad shrugged and said, "We figured it was time for us to reconnect. Besides, you've got plenty of space." I demanded that they leave, but they just laughed it off. "We're staying," Mom said firmly. "It's our right." Things only got worse from there. They'd broken in through a window, but somehow, they acted like they belonged. They brought in their own furniture, cheap, mismatched stuff that clashed with everything in my carefully curated home, and started rearranging the place without asking. My dad took over the living room, setting up a massive TV and claiming the couch as his personal throne. Mom turned the dining room into her makeshift office, cluttering the table with papers and laptops. At first, I thought I could reason with them. I explained that this was my house, that they couldn't just waltz in and take over. But they were prepared. My mom, ever the schemer, pulled out a pile of paperwork and began rattling off some nonsense about squatters' rights and shared familial assets. I didn't understand half of what she was saying, but it became clear that they'd done their homework. They'd found legal loopholes to justify their presence, and there wasn't much I could do about it. To make matters worse, they insisted on paying utilities, just $300 a month. It wasn't enough to cover the bills, but it was apparently enough to establish some sort of claim that they were contributing to the household. Anytime I tried to push back, they'd smugly remind me that they were family and had a right to live there. The tension in the house was unbearable. My dad treated the place like a frat house, staying up all night watching loud action movies and leaving empty beer cans everywhere. My mom micromanaged everything, from how I arranged my pantry to the color of the curtains in my bedroom. Yes, my bedroom. She actually tried to redecorate it while I was at work. I started avoiding the house as much as possible, spending long hours at work or crashing at friends' places. But no matter how much distance I tried to put between us, they were always there, slowly taking over more and more of the house. They even changed the locks one day while I was out, claiming it was for security purposes. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police, hoping they'd help me kick my parents out. But when the officers arrived and heard my parents' side of the story, they shrugged. "It's a civil matter," one of them said. "You'll have to take it to court." Court. The word made my stomach churn. I didn't have the money or the energy for a legal battle, especially not against my own parents. They, on the other hand, seemed to thrive on the drama. My mom even hired a lawyer, a smug guy named Alan, who sent me a cease and desist letter after I tried to move their things out of the guest room. Meanwhile, the situation inside the house kept deteriorating. They started inviting their friends over, loud, obnoxious people who treated my home like a party venue. My neighbors, who had always been friendly, began giving me pitying looks whenever they saw me. Elizabeth, My guardian angel from years ago even stopped by one day to ask if I was okay. I wasn't, but I didn't know what to tell her. The final straw came when they threw a massive party without telling me. I came home from work to find the house packed with strangers, music blasting so loudly the walls shook. My dad was in the backyard, grilling steaks on a barbecue he'd bought with my money, and my mom was holding court in the living room, laughing with her new friends. It was like they'd completely taken over my life. I stormed upstairs, locked myself in my room, and called my grandparents. I hadn't told them the full extent of what was happening. I didn't want to worry them, but I couldn't handle it alone anymore. Ben was furious when he heard what my parents were doing. "They have no right," he said. "We'll figure this out, Jake. Just hang in there." Hearing his voice gave me a glimmer of hope, but I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. My parents weren't going to leave without a fight, and they'd already shown how far they were willing to go to get their way. For now, all I could do was wait and hope for a way out of this nightmare. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end. My parents had turned my home into their personal fiefdom, and every attempt I made to push them out had failed. I tried reasoning with them. I tried calling the police, and I'd even tried changing the locks, only to find myself locked out of my own house. It was clear that they weren't going anywhere unless I took drastic action. So, with a heavy heart, I decided to sue them. The first step was finding a lawyer. I didn't have much money, but Elizabeth, my neighbor and unofficial guardian angel, recommended someone she trusted, a young attorney named Rachel Goodman. Rachel was sharp, no nonsense, and had a way of making me feel like I wasn't completely out of my depth. When I explained the situation to her, she listened without interrupting, her pen flying across a notepad. By the time I finished, she looked up and said, "They don't have a legal leg to stand on. This is going to be messy, but we'll get them out." Messy was an understatement. The process dragged on for 8 grueling months, and every step of the way, my parents fought back like their lives depended on it. They hired a new lawyer, an older man named Charles Green, who seemed to specialize in stalling tactics. He filed motion after motion, each one designed to delay the proceedings and frustrate me into giving up. It worked, to an extent. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd ever get my life back. The court hearings were a surreal experience. Sitting across from my parents in that sterile courtroom, listening to them twist the story to make themselves look like the victims, was infuriating. My mom cried on the stand, claiming I'd invited them to stay and then cruelly turned on them. My dad nodded solemnly, chiming in about how they'd sacrificed so much for me over the years and couldn't understand why I was treating them this way. Their performance was convincing enough that, for a moment, I almost believed it myself. Rachel, thankfully, wasn't fazed. She picked apart their arguments with precision, pointing out inconsistencies and backing everything up with evidence. She brought up the fact that they'd broken into the house, highlighted their refusal to pay proper rent, and even presented photos of the damage they'd done to the property. My parents' lawyer tried to counter, but Rachel was relentless. Watching her in action was one of the few bright spots in an otherwise miserable ordeal. The turning point came during one of the later hearings, when Rachel introduced a witness I hadn't expected, Earl, the retired mechanic who owned the trailer I'd lived in years ago. He'd come forward after hearing about my situation from Elizabeth, and his testimony painted a damning picture of my parents' character. He described how they'd essentially abandoned me, leaving me to fend for myself in a dilapidated trailer, and contrasted that with their current claims of being loving, supportive parents. It was a gut punch to their case. After months of back and forth, delays, and endless stress, the judge finally delivered a verdict. My parents were ordered to vacate the property within 60 days. The relief I felt in that moment was overwhelming. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could see a light at the end of the tunnel. Getting them out, however, was another story. They didn't go quietly. For weeks, they dragged their feet, packing up their belongings one box at a time and leaving the house in a state of chaos. They argued with me constantly, accusing me of betrayal and threatening to appeal the decision. At one point, my dad even threatened to take a sledgehammer to the walls if I didn't let them stay. I had to install security cameras just to keep an eye on the house while I was at work. On the final day of the eviction period, they finally left. I came home to find the house empty but trashed. Holes in the walls, garbage strewn across the floors, and a broken window in the guest bedroom. It was like they wanted to leave one last mark before they were gone. As furious as I was mostly just relieved to have my home back. I later learned that they'd moved to a rented apartment in a neighboring town. The place was a far cry from the house they tried to claim as their own. It was a cramped, dingy unit in a rundown building, with old plumbing that barely worked and a single window that faced a brick wall. They were paying $1,200 a month for the privilege, and from what I heard, they weren't happy about it. Part of me felt sorry for them. Despite everything they'd put me through, they were still my parents. But that sympathy was outweighed by the sheer relief of knowing they were finally out of my life. I could breathe again, sleep in my own bed without worrying about who might be rummaging through my things, and start rebuilding the home they'd nearly destroyed. The legal battle had taken its toll, both emotionally and financially, but it had also taught me something important. I could stand up for myself, even against people who were supposed to have my best interests at heart. It wasn't the ending I'd wanted, but it was the one I'd needed. As I stood in my empty living room that first night after they were gone, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and peace. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, but it was mine again. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally move forward. It had been months since my parents were evicted, and I was still picking up the pieces. The house, my house, was no longer the home I'd worked so hard to build. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of what they'd done. The dents in the hardwood floors where they dragged their cheap furniture, the scuff marks on the walls, and the faint smell of cigarette smoke they'd left behind. Even with the repairs I'd made, it felt tainted. The place didn't feel like mine anymore. I spent hours walking through each room, debating what to do next. The answer came to me one sleepless night as I stared at the ceiling, replaying the last few years in my head. The stress, the betrayal, the constant dread of what my parents might do next. It wasn't something I could live with anymore. If I wanted to truly move on, I needed a fresh start. I decided to sell the house. It wasn't an easy decision. I'd put so much time and effort into making this place a home, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't just a house anymore. It was a battlefield. Every corner of it carried the weight of those 8 months of hell. Selling it felt like the only way to finally put the past behind me. The process of putting the house on the market was overwhelming. I hired a real estate agent, a chipper woman named Lisa, who promised she'd get me top dollar. With the way the market is right now, we could easily get $400,000, she said, her tone so optimistic it almost annoyed me. Still, I needed her expertise, so I nodded along and let her take the lead. Preparing the house for sale was its own kind of therapy. I spent weeks cleaning, painting, and fixing up every little flaw. I replaced the broken window in the guest bedroom, repainted the scuffed walls, and even landscaped the overgrown backyard. With every improvement, I felt a little lighter, like I was scrubbing away the memories my parents had left behind. As the house started to look more presentable, I began planning my next move. I knew one thing for certain. I needed to get far away from here. The thought of running into my parents at the grocery store or, God forbid, having them show up unannounced again was unbearable. I started researching other states, focusing on places where I could afford a fresh start. Colorado, Oregon, and Tennessee were at the top of my list. Each offered a different kind of freedom, a chance to rebuild my life on my own terms. During this time, I reconnected with an old friend, Mia. We'd gone to college together but lost touch after graduation. She'd reached out after hearing about my ordeal through a mutual acquaintance and insisted on meeting up for coffee. At first, I was hesitant. I wasn't in the mood to rehash everything, but her persistence won me over. Mia turned out to be exactly what I needed. She listened without judgment, offering advice when I asked for it, and simply being there when I didn't. Over the weeks, our casual meetups turned into long conversations about life, dreams, and what the future could look like. She was the one who encouraged me to think bigger, to consider not just escaping my past but building something new. "You've been through so much," she said one evening as we sat on a park bench, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "You deserve to find a place where you can be happy. Don't just run away. Run towards something." Her words stuck with me. I started thinking not just about where I wanted to live, but what I wanted my life to look like. I made lists, sketching out ideas for new hobbies, career changes, and even the possibility of going back to school. It felt good to think about the future in a way that wasn't clouded by fear or resentment. The house sold faster than I expected. Within 2 weeks of listing it, Lisa called to tell me we'd received multiple offers, all above asking price. I was stunned. The thought of walking away with more money than I'd ever seen in my life was surreal. After some back and forth, I accepted an offer for $425,000. The paperwork was finalized within a month, and just like that, the house wasn't mine anymore. With the sale complete, I threw myself into planning the move. I settled on Tennessee, drawn to its mix of natural beauty and affordability. I found a small town near the Smoky Mountains that seemed perfect, quiet, picturesque, and far enough for my parents to feel safe. I rented a modest house while I figured out my next steps and packed up my things, leaving behind the memories that had haunted me for so long. In the days leading up to the move, I had a strange sense of closure. I'd spent years feeling trapped by my parents, first by their neglect and then by their intrusion. Selling the house and moving away felt like taking control of my life in a way I never had before. For the first time, I wasn't living in reaction to them. I was living for myself. I also made a decision I hadn't been able to admit to myself until now. I was done with them. Completely, irrevocably done. The thought of ever helping them again, after everything they'd done, was laughable. Their behavior had shown me exactly how selfish and indifferent they were, and I refused to let them drag me down any further. Mia asked me once if I thought I'd ever reconcile with them. "What if they change?" she'd said, her tone gentle but probing. I shook my head. They won't. And even if they did, it wouldn't undo the damage they've done. I have to move on,